Hello and welcome to another episode of Very Japanese Games, a series where I review games released only in Japan. So today, we're going to be looking at a game in one of my favorite genres, horror. Now, when I say Japanese horror games, I'm sure things like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, maybe Siren or Fatal Frame come to mind. But a game that probably doesn't come to mind is today's topic. And that game is Hungry Ghosts. Hungry Ghosts on the PS2. Hungry Ghosts is a game I went into blind. I'd never heard anything about it before, and I had nothing to go on except the description on the box and my general love of horror games. But that it was relatively inexpensive also kind of helped me towards the decision to buy it. But let's just say that I wasn't disappointed with the purchase. So let's get into it. Hungry Ghosts was developed and distributed by Sony for the PlayStation 2. It was released in 2003, and it's a first-person 3D action horror game. The first thing you notice is that the story is pretty basic. A brief discussion in the opening of the game reveals that you are in this sort of pre-hell for having killed a lot of people on a battlefield, and that you must head to the Gate of Judgment to be judged. You also learn that you can change your fate based on your actions in this pre-hell. Beyond that, though, there's not much else to go on. The game runs almost entirely on its atmosphere and the side stories you encounter. The puzzles in the game range from logic puzzles, like figuring out which severed heads belong to 3 criminals you are searching for, to more classic things like finding a missing handle for a well. Many of the puzzles rely on each other, so if you fail to notice or can't figure out earlier ones, you're sometimes locked out of the entire paths to explore. Of course, there's always a path, which is part of the fun of playing. You start the game in an antechamber of sorts that acts as a tutorial for the basic controls. The controls are not standard first-person controls, though. Attacking using weapons and picking up items is handled with the right analog stick, while movement is controlled with the left analog stick. The camera is moved by holding L1 and moving the left analog stick, which is my only complaint because sometimes it makes battles more difficult than they have to be. The areas of the game tend towards either cramped castle or cave-type levels to open-air grottos and graveyards. Each area usually contains a varied amount of puzzles, items, and enemies. Items in the game usually fall into 4 broad categories. You have weapons, which mainly consists of spears, arrows, and throwing knives. Health items, such as various fruits and vegetables that, depending on their color and state, can also be used as weapons against enemies. Quest items. These are usually items that some of the tortured souls that you occasionally come across are searching for. And finally, notes, which, depending on their color, offer information or hints regarding puzzles and what kinds of choices you can make. Basic enemies in the game are ghouls and specters. They usually materialize out of the ground at specific spots or upon specific actions. There are also stronger creatures that spawn and attack at certain points in the game. These tend to be much more difficult than your standard enemy, and may give some people a bit of trouble. Though, sometimes the stronger creatures can be bribed by turning over all types of a certain item. Though really, the game lets you know the most important part of playing before you start, albeit with dialogue before entering the start screen. It tells you that this is a game of choices. The paths you choose or don't choose, the items you take or don't take, and the way you handle each situation changes the game, and consequently the ending you receive. And this is indeed true. My first playthrough only took about 3.5 hours with a mediocre end result. In a more thorough playthrough, though, I spent nearly 3 times that amount of time solving puzzles, finding new areas, and making different choices for a much better end result. The choices and flexibility of the game is a lot of what makes it rather fun to play. For example, do you spend a lot of time figuring out puzzles to find more items that you may or may not need? Do you skip over sections to avoid fights, which raises the violence judgment at the end of the game, but possibly contains items that others may be searching for? Do you help or hinder the various spirits you come across? All of these are choices you have to make and balance in order to get to the end and have a good result. Balancing these various aspects is really the strongest reason to play this game. It's a game that requires you to play differently in order to get a good ending. You have to work to not kill too many enemies, not hoard too much stuff, and figure out when and when not to give up items. It makes this game not only challenging, but fun. Overall, Hungry Ghosts on the PS2 is an atmospheric, first-person horror adventure that gives a lot of replayability and options for ways to progress to finish the game. It offers some creepy moments in a dark world, along with some interesting puzzles and interesting story elements. I recommend this game for all fans of horror games, and also for those who like the gameplay style of the Kingsfield series or the Shadow Tower series. The only downside I can think of for wanting to import this game is that it does tend to have a lot of texts, but even a cursory search would give you a English walkthrough that translates most of the text in the game, so don't let that get in the way of playing this great game. So, that ends another episode of Very Japanese Games, and I hope I was able to introduce you to another great game released only in Japan. So, until next time, keep playing great games, no matter where you live.